Aita for wanting to move out even though my parents expect me to stay home forever? I, 24F, am the youngest of three kids and, according to my parents, the responsible one. My older siblings both moved out as soon as they could. My brother got married young and my sister took a job across the country. Meanwhile, I stayed home for college to save money, and I've been working a decent full-time job ever since I graduated last year. Here's the thing. My parents have kind of decided that I'm never leaving. They talk about it openly, like it's an agreed-upon fact. My mom will say things like, "When you're still here in 10 years," and my dad jokes about converting the basement into an apartment for me and my future husband and kids. Except, they're not really joking. To AT first, I brushed it off. I figured they were just being parents and having a hard time seeing their youngest grow up. But lately, it feels less like a casual joke and more like an expectation. Last month, I casually mentioned to my mom that I'd been looking at apartments in the city. Her reaction? She laughed like I'd said I was moving to the moon. Why would you waste money on rent when you have a perfectly good home right here? I didn't argue. I dropped it. But the idea of staying here forever is starting to feel suffocating. I'm not ungrateful. They've been good parents, and living at home has let me save money. But I want my own space, my own life. I brought it up again last week, and this time, the reaction was not great. When I brought up the idea of moving out again, it didn't go over well. My parents' faces dropped immediately, and the mood at the dinner table shifted. My mom looked hurt, my dad confused. Instead of having a conversation, it turned into a series of guilt-laden arguments about how good I have it at home, no rent, home-cooked meals, and constant family support. They reminded me how expensive rent is, how living alone can be isolating, and how they're getting older and might need me around. Every reason I gave for wanting independence was met with a counterpoint. It felt less like a discussion and more like a courtroom debate where I was trying to justify a crime I hadn't committed. The part that stung the most was when my mom implied that my desire to move out meant I didn't appreciate them or our home. It wasn't true, but it planted a seed of guilt in my mind. By the end of the conversation, I felt emotionally drained and, honestly, a little selfish. They made it seem like wanting to leave was a betrayal, not a natural step in life, but deep down, I knew this wasn't just about saving money or convenience, it was about control. And whether they realized it or not, they were holding on a little too tightly. After that conversation, things didn't return to normal. My parents didn't bring up the topic again, but their behavior spoke louder than words. My mom became overly attentive, packing my lunches, doing my laundry even when I asked her not to, and casually mentioning how quiet the house would be without me. My dad started slipping in comments about how smart I was for saving money by living at home and how renting was just throwing money away. Their intentions weren't malicious, but every action felt like another thread tying me down. It wasn't about helping me, it was about making me feel needed. The routine of living at home started to weigh on me. My mom would wait up if I stayed out late, and I'd feel guilty for making her worry. Decisions about spending money or planning trips felt like they needed to be justified because I was still under their roof. One night, as I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by old photos and leftover relics from high school, it hit me. I wasn't living here, I was trapped here. It wasn't the physical space holding me back, it was the emotional weight of their expectations. And the longer I stayed, the harder it would be to leave. I realized I had to make a choice soon, before that invisible chain became unbreakable. The realization that I felt trapped started eating away at me. Every interaction with my parents felt loaded with unspoken words. Every routine felt like a chain being tightened around my ankles. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in a perfectly comfortable cage. One Saturday afternoon, I sat in my room scrolling through apartment listings. I had a dozen tabs open, tiny studios, overpriced one-bedrooms, places with questionable wallpaper choices, but all of them felt like freedom. I was so focused I didn't hear my mom come in. "What are you looking at?" she asked casually, carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry. I froze, my laptop screen still glowing with a listing for a small place downtown. I tried to close the tab, but it was too late. She'd already seen it. Her expression shifted from curiosity to something I can only describe as heartbreak. "Are you planning to leave us?" she said softly. Her voice wasn't angry, just wounded. And honestly, that made it worse. I stumbled over my words, trying to explain that I wasn't running away, that it wasn't about them, that it was just time. But with every word, her shoulders slumped a little more. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She just nodded, turned, and walked out of the room, leaving the laundry basket on my bed. The rest of the weekend felt like walking on glass. My mom was quiet but visibly upset, her eyes red like she'd been crying in private. My dad avoided me almost entirely. At one point, I heard them talking in hushed voices in the living room. "Did you know about this? She'll change her mind. She's not serious." Later that night, my dad finally said something while we were both in the kitchen. "You know, when your brother and sister moved out, your mom cried for weeks. But we always knew they'd leave. You were different. You're the one who stayed." The words hit me harder than I expected. I realized then that my parents had quietly built their future around me. Their plans, their expectations, their comfort, it all hinged on me staying put. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling in my childhood bedroom, the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck up there as a kid still faintly visible. How had I let it get this far? When did I stop being their daughter and start being their retirement plan? The next morning, I decided I had to rip off the Band-Aid. I couldn't keep letting guilt paralyze me. I had to tell them, clearly and firmly, that I was moving out, but life has a funny way of throwing curveballs. Because just as I was working up the nerve to sit them down for a talk, something happened that changed everything. The plan was simple: sit my parents down, explain my decision calmly, and stick to my point no matter how much guilt or emotion they threw my way. I'd rehearsed it in my head a dozen times. But as with most things in life, the moment didn't go as planned. That Sunday morning, I walked into the kitchen, heart pounding, and found my mom sitting at the table with a stack of medical bills spread out in front of her. My dad was pacing near the window, looking unusually pale. They didn't notice me at first, and I caught a snippet of their conversation. "She doesn't need to know yet." "We'll figure it out," my dad said. "But what if we can't figure it out?" My mom replied, her voice cracking. My stomach dropped. I cleared my throat, and they both looked up, their faces instantly shifting into forced smiles. My mom started gathering the papers like she could hide them from me, but I'd already seen enough. "What's going on?" I asked. There was a long pause before my dad sighed and sat down. Turns out, my mom had been having some ongoing health issues, nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to need regular treatments and medication. On top of that, their insurance wasn't covering everything, and their savings had taken a hit. They weren't in full financial ruin, but they were stressed, scared, and, from the way they were acting, counting on me to help stabilize things by staying home. "We didn't want to worry you," my mom said softly. I felt like the wind had been knocked out of me. On one hand, I was angry that they hadn't told me sooner, angry that they were putting me in a position where leaving felt like abandonment. On the other hand, I understood. They were scared, and in their minds, I was their safety net. For the rest of the day, I stayed quiet, my thoughts racing. Was I being selfish for wanting to leave when they clearly needed me? Was this even the right time? But then another thought crept in: would there ever be a right time? Would there always be another reason to stay, another excuse to keep me rooted here? That night, as I lay in bed staring at those faint glow-in-the-dark stars again, I felt the familiar pull of guilt. But beneath it, there was something else: resentment. I couldn't live my life waiting for the perfect moment to leave because, deep down, I knew it would never come. But how do you tell your parents you're leaving when you know they're struggling? 4 days. I carried the weight of that conversation like a stone in my chest. Every time I sat down with my parents, I'd lose my nerve. My mom would hum while cooking dinner, my dad would ask about my day, and I'd feel like the villain in my own story, but the resentment kept growing. Not at them specifically, but at the situation, at the way love and obligation had tangled themselves into this impossible knot. I kept asking myself the same question: if not now, then when? One Friday evening, I decided it was time. I waited until after dinner when we were all still sitting at the table. My dad was finishing his coffee, my mom was scrolling through her phone, and I just said it. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I need to tell you something. They both looked up, and even though I'd planned every word in my head, the speech I'd prepared disappeared. What came out instead was raw and clumsy. I told them I loved them, that I was grateful for everything they'd done for me, but that I needed to move out. Not because I didn't care about them, but because I needed to build my own life. My mom started crying almost immediately. My dad went quiet, staring at his mug. We thought you were happy here, my mom said between shaky breaths. We thought we were. Enough. Those words broke me a little. It wasn't about them not being enough, it was about me wanting to be enough for myself. But how do you explain that without sounding cruel? My dad spoke next, his voice low. You've seen the bills. You know how things are right now. Are you sure this is the right time to leave? And there it was, the final, heavy anchor holding me down. I had to take a deep breath before answering. I know things are tough, and I'll help. I'll contribute financially while I'm still here, and I'll keep helping even after I move out. But I can't keep putting my life on hold because the timing isn't perfect. It'll never be perfect. They didn't say much after that. My mom wiped her tears quietly, and my dad nodded, though his face was tight with worry. The rest of the evening passed in awkward silence, and when I went back to my room, I felt like I'd just run a marathon. My chest was tight, my head was pounding, but beneath all of that, there was something else. Relief. I'd finally said it. The words were out in the open, and there was no taking them back, but the hardest part wasn't over yet, because now I had to follow through. The days after our conversation were heavy with unspoken words. My parents weren't angry, but the disappointment hung in the air like smoke after a fire. My mom moved through the house quieter than usual, her eyes red-rimmed every morning. My dad stopped making his usual small talk at breakfast, like he couldn't decide if he was upset with me or proud of me. I started looking at apartments more seriously, reaching out to landlords and scheduling viewings. Every click of a new listing felt like a small act of rebellion. I had to remind myself over and over that wanting my own life wasn't selfish. One evening, while I was packing up a few boxes in my room, my mom knocked softly on my door. She came in holding a stack of neatly folded bedsheets. It was such a mom thing to do, preparing me with something practical even while her heart was breaking. Have you found a place yet? She asked, her voice small. Yeah, I said. It's not much, but it feels right. She sat down on my bed and looked around my room. You know, when you were little, you used to say you'd live here forever. You said you'd build a treehouse in the backyard and stay there even when you were a grown-up. We both laughed a little, but there were tears in her eyes. I'm proud of you, she said finally. I want you to know that. I'm just scared. It feels like everything changes when you walk out that door. I sat next to her, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel like we were on opposite sides. Things are going to change, I said gently. But I'll still be here. I'll still visit, I'll still call. Moving out doesn't mean I'm leaving you. She nodded, and we sat there in silence for a while. The day I moved out was quiet. No grand speeches, no dramatic tears, just a lot of long hugs and a car packed to the brim with boxes. My dad helped me carry my desk down the stairs, and my mom tucked a bag of homemade snacks into my front seat. When I pulled out of the driveway, they stood together on the porch, waving as I drove away. I didn't make it 2 blocks before I had to pull over and cry in my car, but mixed in with the sadness was something else, something lighter, something that felt like freedom. The first night in my tiny, slightly overpriced apartment was surreal. I ate takeout on the floor because I didn't have a dining table yet, and the place felt way too quiet. But it was mine. My parents called me the next day to check in. My mom asked if I'd eaten, my dad asked if I needed any tools. They were still them, and I was still me. It's been a few months now, and things are better. We've settled into a new rhythm. I visit every Sunday for dinner, and they've stopped making comments about how I could always move back. Leaving home was one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it was also one of the most important. Sometimes love means holding on. And sometimes it means letting go. Aita? I don't think so. But man, it sure felt like it at the time.
What would you do in a similar situation? Share your opinion in the comments.